The creature that emerged from the darkness was something out of a nightmare, and Cale felt his legs go weak beneath him as his mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing, because nothing in his 12 years of life had prepared him for this moment. It was a Shrike-Maw, one of the apex predators that haunted the deep canyons of Dusthaven 7, and every colonist knew about them, but few had ever seen one and lived to describe the experience. And now Cale understood why, because the thing was death made flesh-ate. Legs carried its armored body forward with a horrible clicking grace, each limb ending in curved claws that scraped against the rocks like knives on bone, and its body was covered in black chitin that gleamed like oil in the fading firelight. The head was the worst part, an elongated skull filled with rows of serrated teeth that folded back into the mouth like the petals of some terrible flower, and venom dripped from those fangs in long strings that sizzled when they hit the ground. Its eyes were multiple red points of light that fixed on them with hungry intelligence, and the creature made that clicking sound again as it tasted the air. With a long forked tongue, the smell of blood had drawn it here. Cale realized the strange glowing blood of the alien girl was like a dinner bell ringing out across the canyon, and now they were both going to die because of his decision to help a stranger. The girl was screaming at him in her language, the same word over and over. And even though Cale did not speak her tongue, he knew exactly what she was saying, because there was only one thing anyone would say in this moment. She was telling him to run, and Cale knew he should run, knew it with every fiber of his being, because he was 12 years old and unarmed and small, and the Shrike-Maw was a killing machine that had evolved over millions of years to be the perfect predator. He could probably make it to the canyon wall and climb to safety before the creature caught him. Probably escape with his life if he moved right now without hesitation. Probably live to see another sunrise if he just abandoned this alien girl to her fate. The Shrike-Maw took another step forward, and its many eyes shifted from Cale to the wounded girl behind him, and he could almost see the calculation happening in that primitive brain. The recognition that one prey was helpless while the other could flee it was going to kill her first. Cale did not run later. He would try to explain this moment to others and find that words failed him, because there was no logic to what he did next, no careful reasoning or brave decision. Just a feeling that rose up from somewhere deep inside him and refused to be ignored. He stepped between the girl and the beast. The Shrike-Maw actually paused, its head tilting to one side as if confused by this strange behavior. And perhaps in all its years of hunting, it had never encountered prey that moved toward danger. Instead of away from it, Cale bent down and grabbed a jagged piece of hull metal from the scattered wreckage, a makeshift weapon that felt pathetically small in his trembling hands, and he planted his feet and faced the monster. "You want her," he said, and his voice cracked with fear, but he forced the words out anyway. "You have to go through me first." The girl behind him had stopped screaming, and Cale could hear her ragged breathing, could sense her confusion and disbelief at what she was witnessing. But he did not turn to look at her because he could not take his eyes off the Shrike-Maw. The creature hissed, a sound like steam escaping from a cracked pipe. And then it charged. Everything happened very fast after that. Cale threw a rock at its face with his left hand while clutching his metal shard in his right, and the rock bounced harmlessly off the creature's armored skull, but it flinched slightly. And that gave Cale a fraction of a second to move. He dove to the side as though snapping jaws closed on empty air where he had been standing, and he slashed at the creature's leg with his improvised blade and felt the metal bite into the gap between chitin plates. The Shrike-Maw screamed, a horrible sound that echoed off the canyon walls, and it spun toward him with terrible speed, one of its legs lashing out and catching him in the chest and sending him tumbling across the rocky ground. Pain exploded through his body, but Cale forced himself to roll and keep moving, because stopping meant dying, and he scrambled to his feet, just as the creature lunged again. This time, he was not fast enough. The Shrike-Maw's jaws closed on his shoulder, fangs punching through flesh and muscle like needles through cloth. And Kale screamed as fire erupted through his veins, the creature's venom burning into his bloodstream. But even as the pain consumed him, even as his vision started to blur and his thoughts began to scatter, Kale's hand moved with desperate purpose. He drove the jagged metal shard into the creature's eye. The Shrike Maw released him with a shriek of agony, rearing back on its hind legs as black ichor poured from its ruined eye, and Kale fell to the ground, but somehow kept his grip on his weapon. The creature snapped at him again, and he stabbed upward, catching it in the soft tissue of its mouth, and again when it tried to pin him with its claws, opening a gash along its neck that sprayed more of that dark blood. Something had taken over Kale's body, some instinct older than thought, and he fought with a ferocity that surprised even himself, slashing and stabbing and refusing to stop no matter how much his body screamed for him to give up. The Shrike Maw finally retreated, backing away with that horrible clicking sound, now mixed with whimpers of pain, its remaining eyes fixed on this small creature that had hurt it so badly. And then it turned and fled into the darkness of the canyon. Kale watched it go, and then his legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto the rocky ground, and the venom was spreading through his body now, making his muscles twitch and spasm, making his vision swim with strange colors. And he could feel his heartbeat slowing down as the poison did its work. The alien girl was crawling toward him, dragging her injured leg behind her, and her golden eyes were filled with tears as she reached out and touched his face with trembling blue fingers. She spoke a single word, a voice soft and wondering. And even though Kale could not understand her language, he somehow knew what she was asking. Why had he done this? Why had he risked his life for a stranger? Why had he stood between her and death when every sensible creature in the galaxy would have run? Kale tried to answer, but his mouth would not work properly, the venom stealing his ability to speak, and all he could do was look up at this strange, beautiful alien girl and hope that somehow she understood. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was her face above his, those golden eyes wide with something he could not name. And then there was nothing but the cold and the dark and the feeling of falling into an endless void far above them, unseen by either child. A ship descended through the atmosphere with weapons armed and warriors ready, following the distress beacon that had been activated when the first ship crashed. Help was coming. But for Kale Mercer, it might already be too late. The sun was setting over the rust-colored canyons of Dusthaven 7, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple that made the whole world look like it was burning from the inside out. And 12-year-old Kale Mercer sat on a rocky ledge watching the colors change while the wind carried dust across his face. He came here almost every evening after finishing his work, climbing up to this spot where he could see for miles in every direction. And he liked the silence of it all, because silence was rare in the mining colony where machines never stopped grinding and people never stopped shouting. Dusthaven 7 was not a kind world, and everyone who lived there knew it, but it was home to Kale and his father Marcus, who ran salvage operations in the deep canyons where old ships and broken equipment lay scattered like the bones of dead giants. Kale had learned to scavenge before he learned to read properly, and his hands were already rough with calluses from climbing and digging and prying open sealed containers. And his father always said that the frontier made people hard or it buried them. And Kale intended to be hard tonight felt different somehow, and Kale could not explain why. But there was a tension in the air, like the feeling before a lightning storm. And he found himself scanning the darkening sky as if expecting something to appear then. A diddy streak of violet fire tore across the heavens, and Kale jumped to his feet with his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. And he watched as the object screamed overhead, trailing smoke and flames that were not the right color. Not orange or yellow, but a strange purple that hurt his eyes to look at. It was a ship, but not like any ship Kale had ever seen in his life. And the mining colony had plenty of ships coming and going, but none of them looked like a curved blade made of dark metal. And none of them burned with alien fire. The ship disappeared beyond the eastern ridgeline, and then came the sound. A terrible crash that shook the ground beneath his feet and sent rocks tumbling down the canyon walls. And Cale stood there breathing hard with his mind racing through everything his father had ever taught him. His father had taught him to be careful, to never go toward danger, to always think before acting, and to remember that curiosity killed more frontier colonists than any beast or bandit ever did. Cale started running toward the crash site. He did not know why he ran, could not explain the pull he felt in his chest, but his legs carried him across the rocky terrain as the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear overhead. Cold and distant and uncaring, the canyon where the ship had crashed was half a mile from his watching spot, and Cale covered the distance faster than he ever had before, scrambling over rocks and sliding down slopes with reckless speed that would have made his father furious when he reached the edge of the canyon and looked down. His breath caught in his throat. The ship lay in pieces across the canyon floor, and the strange purple flames were dying down now, but they still cast enough light for Cale to see the destruction. Twisted metal and shattered components and deep gouges in the earth where the ship had skidded and tumbled before finally coming to rest. Something moved among the wreckage. Cale froze and watched and felt his heart hammering against his ribs. And then he saw her clearly in the fading firelight, and everything he thought he knew about the universe shifted and changed. Forever she was a girl, roughly his own age or perhaps a little older. And she was not human. Her skin was pale blue like the ice that formed in the deep caves during winter. And her hair was silver white and fell around her shoulders like liquid moonlight. And from her temples curved 4 delicate horns that swept back over her skull in an elegant pattern that looked almost like a crown. She was trapped, her leg pinned beneath a large piece of debris, and she was trying to pull herself free, but her movements were weak and desperate, and Cale could see strange blood pooling beneath her, luminescent and glowing faintly gold in the darkness. Everything his father had ever said about aliens came rushing back to him in that moment. Warnings about species that saw humans as food or slaves or enemies. Stories about first contact situations that ended in bloodshed. Advice to never approach an unknown being without backup and weapons and a clear escape route. The girl looked up and saw him standing on the ridge. Her eyes were gold like her blood, large and tilted and filled with terror and pain. And she made a sound that might have been words in a language Cale did not understand. Her voice sharp and hissing like a warning. Like she was telling him to run away. She was afraid of him, Cale realized. And something about that broke through all the warnings and all the fear and all the sensible caution that should have kept him rooted to the spot. She was hurt and alone and scared. And she was just a kid like him. And nobody else was coming to help her. Cale climbed down into the canyon. The girl watched him approach with those wide golden eyes. And she kept making those warning sounds, kept trying to push herself away from him, even though she could not move with her leg trapped. And Cale could see now that she was crying. Strange tears that glowed faintly in the darkness. He held up his hands to show he meant no harm, moving slowly, speaking softly even though she could not understand his words. "I am not going to hurt you," he said. And his voice sounded strange in his own ears, too calm for what he was feeling inside. "I am going to help you. Okay. Just stay still and let me help." He knelt beside her and examined the debris pinning her leg. A curved section of hull plating that was heavy, but not impossibly so. And he wedged his fingers beneath it and started to lift, his muscles straining and his teeth clenched with effort. The girl had stopped making warning sounds now and was just watching him with an expression he could not read. Something between confusion and wonder and disbelief. As if she could not understand what she was seeing, Cale lifted the debris and shoved it aside. and the girl gasped in pain as her leg came free. And he could see now that the limb was badly damaged, possibly broken. And the glowing blood was flowing more freely. Now he needed to stop the bleeding and get her somewhere safe and figure out how to help her. And he had no idea how to do any of those things, but he was going to try anyway, because that was what you did when someone needed help. That was when he heard the sound behind him. A clicking, chittering noise that made every hair on his body stand up. And the girl's golden eyes went wide with fresh terror as she looked past him. Into the darkness of the canyon. Kale turned around slowly, and his blood ran cold. Something was coming out of the shadows. Something with too many legs and too many teeth. And its eyes reflected the dying firelight like red stars burning in the void. The girl screamed something in her alien language, a single word that needed no translation run. Kale woke to the smell of something strange and sweet, like flowers mixed with wood smoke. And for a long moment, he simply lay still with his eyes closed, trying to remember where he was and how he had gotten there. His body ached in ways he had never experienced before, a deep throbbing pain that seemed to pulse through every muscle and bone. And when he tried to move his right arm, he discovered that it was wrapped in something soft and warm that held it firmly against his chest. Memory came flooding back in fragments. The crashed ship and the blue-skinned girl and the shrike maw and the terrible burning of venom spreading through his veins. And Kale's eyes snapped open as panic seized his heart. He was not on Dusthaven 7 anymore. The ceiling above him was made of some kind of fabric that shimmered with inner light. Threads of silver and gold woven together in patterns that seemed to move and shift when he looked at them. And the air was different here, cleaner and colder, and carrying scents he did not recognize. Kale turned his head and saw that he was lying on a pile of furs inside a great tent. And the furs were soft and thick and came from animals he could not identify. And beside his bed sat small tables covered with bowls and bottles and strange instruments. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his shoulder. And he fell back with a gasp that drew attention from somewhere beyond his field of vision. Footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate. And then a figure moved into view, and Kale felt his breath catch in his throat. The alien standing over him was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, with the same blue skin and silver hair as the girl from the canyon, but with features that were harder and fiercer. And 4 great horns curved back from his temples like a crown made of bone. His body was covered in scars, some old and faded and some relatively fresh. And his golden eyes studied Kale with an intensity that made the boy feel like a specimen. Under examination, more figures appeared behind the first. Warriors carrying weapons and wearing armor made of dark metal that gleamed in the soft light. And their expressions ranged from hostile to curious to something that might have been disgust. Kale realized he was surrounded by aliens, surrounded by beings who might see humans as enemies or prey. And he was wounded and helpless and very far from home. Then a familiar voice cut through the tension, sharp and insistent, and the crowd parted to let someone through. It was the girl from the canyon, the one he had saved, and her leg was wrapped in some kind of glowing bandage, but she was walking on her own. And she pushed past the warriors until she stood beside the giant alien, who seemed to be their leader. She spoke rapidly in her language, gesturing at Kale, and then at her own leg, and then making motions that seemed to describe the shrike maw. And as she talked, the expressions of the warriors around them began to change. The giant alien listened without interrupting, his golden eyes never leaving Kale's face. And when the girl finally finished speaking, he was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his belt and pulled out a small device that he held up to his mouth, speaking words that Kale did not understand. And when he lowered the device, his voice emerged from it in heavily accented but understandable English. "The child of my blood tells me that you saved her life," he said. And his voice was deep and rumbling like distant thunder. "She tells me that you faced a shrike maw, with nothing but scrap metal in your hands, and that you did not run, even when the beast attacked. Kale did not know what to say, did not know if he should speak or stay silent. So he simply nodded. "My people are the Calvaroth," the giant continued. "We are warriors born from warriors, bred for combat across 1,000 generations. And we do not run from battle, because that is our way and our honor." He paused, studying Kale with those piercing golden eyes. "But you are human, and your kind are known to us only as soft creatures who fight with machines and trickery, who flee from danger and strike from hiding, who have no honor worth speaking of." The words stung, but Kale held the alien's gaze and said nothing. "So I ask you this, small human, and I expect truth in your answer," the giant said. "Why did you not run? Why did you stand between my daughter and death? Why did you fight a beast that you could not hope to defeat?" Kale thought about the question, thought about that moment in the canyon when every instinct had screamed at him to flee, and something else had made him stay. And he tried to find words that would explain something he barely understood himself. "Because she was scared," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse. "Because she was hurt and alone and nobody else was coming to help her." He met the giant alien's eyes. "Because it was the right thing to do." The tent went very quiet, and Kale could see the warriors exchanging glances, could see confusion and skepticism on their alien faces. But he also saw something else in some of their expressions, something that might have been respect. The giant alien stared at him for a long moment, and then he did something that made every warrior in the tent draw a sharp breath of surprise. He knelt down, lowering his massive body until his horned head was level with Kale's. And then he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against the boy's in a gesture of unmistakable significance. "I am Torvan the Unyielding," he said, his voice soft now, almost gentle, "chief of the 7th tribe of the Calvaroth, and I have led my people through wars that would break lesser beings." He pulled back slightly, his golden eyes locked with Kale's brown ones. "In all my years I have never seen courage like what my daughter described. The courage of a child facing certain death to protect a stranger. The courage of a soul that does not know how to surrender." Torvan stood and turned to face his warriors. And when he spoke again, his voice rang out like a war drum. "This human bears the mark of the Shrike Maw, and yet he lives. He fought the beast and drove it away. He stood when he should have fallen and refused to yield when he should have died." He pointed at Kale with one massive hand. "By the ancient right of Vahal Shaken, I claim this boy as bloodkin, as a son of my house and a warrior of my tribe. Let none challenge this bond or question his place among us." The warriors began to murmur, some in protest and some in wonder, but Torvan silenced them with a look. "Courage is not the absence of fear," he said, his eyes returning to Kale. "It is standing when every part of you screams to run. It is fighting when all hope is lost. It is protecting the weak even at the cost of your own life." He smiled, and it transformed his fierce face into something almost warm. "You carry the mark of the beast now, boy, but you also carry the heart of Calvaroth. And from this day forward, you are my son." Kale looked at the alien chief, at the warriors surrounding him, at the girl who had become his sister with a few words from her father, and he felt something shift inside him, something that had been broken and lonely for a very long time, for the first time since his mother had died. Kale Mercer had a family, and this time he would fight to keep them. The venom of the Shrike Maw had changed Kale in ways that the Calvaroth healers did not fully understand, leaving marks on his body that would never fade, and alterations to his blood that made him something more than human. Black lines spread from his shoulder, wound across his neck and down his arm, looking like cracks in pale stone filled with dark ink. And they pulsed faintly when his heart beat fast or when strong emotions gripped him. His senses had sharpened beyond normal human limits. allowing him to see in darkness that would have blinded him before and hear sounds that existed at the very edge of perception. And his reflexes had quickened until he could catch objects thrown at him. Without conscious thought, the Calvarath had a name for those who survived beast venom, calling them Shalkith, which meant death touched in their tongue. And they believed that such survivors were blessed by the spirits of war, and marked for greatness scale did not feel blessed. He felt exhausted and confused and very far from home. But he was determined to earn his place among these strange, fierce people who had adopted him as one of their own. Training began as soon as his wounds healed enough to allow movement. And it was harder than anything Kale had ever experienced in his life. They, Calvarath, trained their young from childhood in the arts of war, teaching them to fight with blade and body until combat became as natural as breathing. And Kale was years behind the other students in skill and decades behind them in physical capability. His sparring partners were Calvarath youth his own age, but they stood a foot taller than him and weighed twice as much, with muscles that rippled under their blue skin and bones that were denser than human bone. They had claws and fangs and could see in complete darkness without the aid of venom-enhanced senses. They could hold their breath for 30 minutes and survive in hard vacuum for short periods. They healed from wounds that would kill a human, and our Kale had none of these advantages. And in his first month of training, he lost every single match he fought. The Calvarath youth were not cruel to him, but they were not gentle either, viewing him as a curiosity more than a true peer, a strange pet that their chief had inexplicably adopted. And some of them made it clear that they did not consider him worthy of the honor he had been given. Virashi was different, standing beside him when others mocked, and training with him when others refused. And over time, their bond deepened from gratitude into genuine friendship, a connection that transcended the differences between their species. "You are too small," she told him one evening after watching him lose another sparring match, her golden eyes thoughtful as she handed him water. "You will never be as strong as us or as fast as us. So you must learn to fight in ways that we do not expect." Kale wiped blood from his lip and nodded. Already thinking about what she had said, he began to study the Calvarath fighting style, not to copy it, but to understand it, learning its patterns and rhythms so that he could predict what his opponents would do. Before they did, I started training twice as long as the others, waking before dawn and practicing until his muscles screamed. And he learned to use his small size as an advantage rather than a weakness, slipping under attacks and striking at angles that his larger opponents could not easily defend. Months passed, and Kale kept losing. But the nature of his losses began to change. He lasted longer in each match, survived attacks that would have finished him before, and occasionally landed strikes that made his opponents grunt in surprise. And though he never won, he never stopped getting up no matter how many times he was knocked down. The Calvarath warriors began to notice, gathering to watch his training sessions with expressions of confused interest. And Kale could hear them talking about him in their language, could see them pointing at the small human who refused to stay down. One day, an elder warrior named Karth approached him after a particularly brutal training session, and Kale braced himself for criticism or mockery. But instead, the old alien looked at him with something like wonder in his scarred face. "I have fought beside the greatest warriors of 5 tribes," Korath said through his translator. "I have seen courage and skill that would make legends weep, but I have never seen anything quite like you." Kale blinked in surprise, not understanding. "You have no armor, no claws, no venom, no strength worth speaking of," Korath continued. "By all reason, you should have given up long ago. Should have accepted that you are outmatched and stopped wasting everyone's time." He shook his head slowly. "But you keep getting up. Every time we knock you down, you rise again. And I am beginning to understand something about your species that I never knew before." Karth leaned closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. You humans are not dangerous because you are strong or fast or deadly. You are dangerous because you do not know when you're supposed to lose. Word spread through the tribe about the strange human boy who would not stay down. And attitudes began to shift. Warriors who had dismissed him now nodded in respect when he passed. And even those who still doubted his worthiness could not deny his determination on the anniversary of his adoption. Torvald summoned Kale before the assembled tribe and presented him with a gift that made the young man's heart swell with pride. It was a warrior's name, earned through months of struggle and pain and refusal to surrender. And from that day forward, he would be known as Kale Shalmer. The boy who stood Varashi cheered louder than anyone. And when she embraced him afterward, Kale felt tears in his eyes that he quickly blinked away. You are truly one of us now, brother, she said, and the word struck him like a blow, filling a hollow place in his chest that he had carried for so long. But even as Kale celebrated his achievement, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, whispers reaching the tribe of raiders massing at the edge of Kalvara's space. The same raiders who had shot down Varashi's ship and said this entire story in motion war was coming. And Kale Shalmer would be ready to meet. I've trained harder than ever in the following months, pushing himself beyond exhaustion, beyond pain, beyond everything he thought he could endure, and slowly, match by match, he began to win not through strength or speed or any natural advantage, but through sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat, through a will that burned brighter than any fire and refused to be extinguished. The Kalvarath had taught him to be a warrior, but his humanity had taught him something more important, that the size of the fight in the heart mattered more than the size of the body that carried it, and when the raiders came, they would learn that lesson too. 3 years had passed since a scared boy had stood between a monster and an alien girl in a canyon on a dusty frontier world, and the young man who now stood in the war council of the Kalvarath barely resembled that child. Kale Shalmer was 15 years old, lean and hard and covered in scars that told stories of countless battles and training matches, and the black marks of the Shrikemaw's venom had spread across his skin like a living tattoo that pulsed with his heartbeat. He stood among the greatest warriors of the tribe, his human stature still small compared to their towering forms, but his presence somehow equal. And he listened as the elders debated the threat that had finally arrived. The raiders had come, a fleet of warships belonging to a slaver consortium that had hunted Kalvarath for generations. And this time, they had brought enough firepower to threaten even the mighty warrior tribes. Their leader was a creature called Vex Run, a being of cruelty and cunning who had made his fortune selling Kalvarath prisoners to the highest bidder. And he wanted revenge for years of failed raids and lost ships. The elders spoke of retreat, of gathering strength and striking back later, of preserving the tribe, even if it meant losing territory and honor. And Kale could see the pain in Torvald's eyes as his advisors counseled caution. Kale stepped forward, and the council fell silent. My father once asked me why I stood against the Shrikemaw, he said, his voice steady and clear, and I told him it was because no one else was coming to help. He looked around at the assembled warriors, meeting each set of golden eyes in turn. But I have learned something in my time among you, something about what it means to be Kalvarath and what it means to be human. And the answer is simpler than I thought. He turned to face his adopted father. We stand because that is who we are. We fight because the alternative is to kneel. And we do not retreat because there are some things worth dying for. The elders muttered in disapproval, but Torvald held up a hand for silence, his scarred face unreadable. What would you have us do, my son? He asked. Our fleet is outnumbered, and their command ship carries weapons that could crack a moon. Kale smiled, and there was something almost feral in the expression. My people have a saying, he replied. You do not have to be the biggest. You just have to be the one still standing at the end. He outlined his plan. A strike mission that would take a small team directly to the enemy command ship, while the Calvorath fleet engaged the raiders in open battle. A team that would infiltrate and destroy the vessel from within it was a suicide mission, and everyone in the room knew it. But Cale had learned that sometimes the impossible was just something nobody had been crazy enough to try. The elders rejected the plan immediately, calling it foolish and wasteful and typical of human recklessness. But Torvan overruled them with a single raised hand. "I have seen what humans do when told something is impossible," the chief said, rising to his full height. "They do it anyway. And I have learned to trust my son's madness." He placed a massive hand on Cale's shoulder. "My son will lead this mission, and I will follow him into the fire." The battle that followed would become legend among the Calvorath, sung in songs and told in stories for generations to come. The fleet engaged the raiders in a storm of fire and metal, ships burning like stars in the void as the two forces clashed. And while the enemy was focused on the battle, a small craft slipped through the chaos and latched onto the command ship's hull. Cale led the team through the breaching hatch and into the corridors of the enemy vessel, Varashi at his side and a dozen of the tribe's finest warriors at his back. And they fought their way through wave after wave of defenders. The slavers were not prepared for an assault from within, had never imagined that anyone would be bold enough or foolish enough to try such a thing. And their confusion was the only advantage Cale needed. He took wounds that would have killed a Calvorath twice over. Energy burns and blade cuts and impacts that cracked ribs and shattered bone. But the venom in his blood pushed him forward when his body should have failed. The team planted charges throughout the ship, setting them to detonate simultaneously. And one by one, the warriors fell, protecting their human leader until only Cale and Varashi remained. They reached the command deck to find Vexron waiting for them, surrounded by his personal guard. And the slaver lord looked at the battered, bloody human standing before him with disbelief in his many eyes. "You should be dead," Vexron hissed. "No creature could survive what you have endured." Cale raised his blade, his arm shaking with exhaustion, but his eyes burning with determination. "You know what the difference is between your kind and mine?" he asked. And his voice was calm despite the pain that racked his body. Vexron snarled, and his guards moved forward. "You fight to win," Cale continued. "We fight because we do not know how to stop." The final battle was brief and brutal. Varashi fighting beside her brother with the skill and fury of her ancestors, while Cale moved like a ghost through the enemy ranks, his enhanced senses and human unpredictability combining into something the slavers could not counter. When Vexron finally fell to Cale's blade, the boy activated the detonator. The explosion ripped through the command ship as Cale and Varashi sprinted for the escape pods, flames licking at their heels and debris raining down around them. And they barely made it to safety before the vessel tore itself apart in a bloom of fire that lit up the void. The slaver fleet scattered without their command ship. Easy prey for the Calvorath warriors who had been waiting for this moment. And within hours the battle was won. Cale woke in the healer's tent, his body wrapped in bandages and his blood more medicine than cells. And Varashi was there, holding his hand with tears streaming down her blue cheeks. Torvan came to him later, carrying a gift wrapped in cloth. And when he unwrapped it, Cale saw a blade forged from the fang of the shrike maw that had bitten him years ago. "We recovered this from Dusthaven 7, the chief said, placing the weapon in Cale's hands. "It seemed fitting that you should carry part of the beast that made you what you are." Cale looked at the blade, at his sister, at the stars visible through the tent opening, and he felt something settle in his chest, a sense of purpose that had been growing for years. "You are Calvorath," Torvan said, "but never forget that your strength comes from being human. The galaxy does not yet understand what that means." He placed a hand on Cale's scarred shoulder and smiled. "One day they will." Cale gripped the fang blade, and met his father's eyes with a promise burning in his own. Then I will make sure they learn. Outside the tent, the warriors sang songs of victory. And among those songs was a new verse about a human boy who had stood against the darkness and refused to fall, who had taught the mighty Calvarth that courage came in many sizes, and that sometimes the smallest warriors cast the longest shadows. The boy who stood had become a man, and his story was only beginning.